Hello Tech Time Travelers, and this is why you should never get into YouTubing. Okay, so if you're new here, no, this isn't a school bus channel, this is a vintage technology channel, and yes, I guess school buses count as technology, although not the computer kind we usually mess around with here. But I do plan on sprinkling in a few videos about what I'm calling Big Blue for now, because variety is the spice of life and all that, right? Just a sprinkle, regular viewers. Don't worry, we're not going full on school bus here. So getting into it, yep, I bought a school bus. A 1966 Bluebird school bus riding on a Dodge chassis, if we want to be precise. Why? Well, to use as a YouTube studio, of course, because this is the kind of thing that YouTubing can make seem sensible. Okay, I didn't go shopping for a bus specifically as a YouTube studio. This was a convergence of two parallel tracks of thought. You see, long before I was a vintage computer guy, I was a vintage car guy, and I still am. I've had an array of vintage vehicles, Trans Ams, Chevys, even Edsels, mostly of questionable character. I just love old cars with personality. Actually, my real passion is spending money I don't have on stuff I don't need. Anyway, it had been a few years since I'd given up my last vintage vehicle, and every summer I found myself thinking about diving back into that world again. But for the most part, it was just look-see until I stumbled across an old 1947 school bus on Facebook Marketplace. I found myself immediately going down a rabbit hole. The thing about rabbit holes, though, is sometimes you find yourself in a rabbit warren. First, seeing school buses always brings back happy memories of my childhood in the 1980s. I rode a school bus to and from our brand new house in Ontario for a couple years until I changed schools. I remembered everything: the smell of the vinyl seats, the scream of the transmission, the sheer size and bulk of the bus. I remember being anxious waiting for it to come take me to school. I never really liked school. I remember some of the characters who were our drivers: Linda, a short, stout lady who drove our 5-speed GMC Bluebird like it was nobody's business. Or another lady nicknamed the Whistler because if you weren't behaving, she would shut you up instantly with her ear-piercing whistle. Anyway, I started reading up about hot rodding school buses, and that made me think of maybe doing something like that with this old REO bus I'd found, since it kind of looked the part. But the seller added some pictures later, and it turned out to be a really long one. That led me into a bus-dwelling community known as skoolies. A skoolie is kind of a school bus enthusiast with a specific focus on converting school buses into mobile habitats. The skoolie community trades tips on buying buses, converting buses, electrical, solar power, you name it. It's a fascinating little community. It just went on, and my interest levels went to 11 really fast. That's one of the two parallel thought tracks my brain was on. The other one was, well, I'm sure my hardcore subscribers have noticed, my YouTube output has been pretty light lately. That's mostly due to my day job, which ate up most of my summer, most evenings, and even long weekends this year. It left very little time for doing tech stuff, and especially filming it. Another problem that has bedeviled me since I started was not having a dedicated space for YouTube filming. Quite honestly, I never expected my channel to grow to nearly 40,000 subscribers when I started, and I've always been very practical, read cheap, when it comes to spending on stuff like YouTube. 4 years on, I still haven't bought a proper camera for the channel, preferring to spend on a decent cell phone which can at least be used for other things. And that's the issue I have with filming space. Our house is a good size, but there's really nowhere I can set up as a permanent, dedicated studio. Every available space for filming is needed for other things too. I used to film in part of our rec room, but my wife enjoys hanging out there, and I feel bad asking her to leave because I'm too socially awkward to film with her there. Also, that half of the room looks like crap because it's where my day job workbench is, and I've just never liked the way it looked on camera. The other room I've tried, which you've seen more recently, is my home office, but this room is even harder because it's about 10 by 10 and it's jam-packed with my office gear, my model trains, and a whole bunch of computers. Yeah, it's a nightmare to move around in. Both spaces have sound issues too. The way our house is designed, the first floor is considered the basement, all the main living quarters are upstairs. Which means all the main people are upstairs making all kinds of noises which my microphone is only too happy to pick up. So even when I had time to film, often I couldn't because I'd need people to be either asleep or away. And moving all the light equipment and stuff back and forth, it was just becoming a huge deterrent to filming at all. Now, I did think about ways to fix this. Converting my garage to a studio was one idea, but I like having a garage for garage stuff, so that was out. I also looked at building a studio like 8-Bit Guy recently did, but while my yard has the room for it, my budget doesn't. Even just a 10 by 10 space could cost well over 20,000 bucks Canadian. Sorry, but I'm not Mr. Beast. I considered other options like sea cans, but those cost decent bucks too, and then you gotta transport and crane them in place, and unfortunately our district doesn't allow them in your yards anyway, so scratch that. Anyway, where my two tracks of thought merged one day was when I was looking at Facebook Marketplace again and stumbled on this very blue 1960s Dodge or Fargo or whatever it is school bus. I really loved the pics of the interior I saw, which was done up entirely in Western red cedar. It had a very homey cabin kind of feel. And that's when my brain made the connection. Wood, computers. Aha, a light bulb went on. Well, sort of a half-dead fluorescent one anyway. A school bus, yes, because that's the answer to my YouTube and my desire for a vintage vehicle problem. Now hear me out, a school bus is 100 plus square feet of space with no toilets flushing overhead. And this bus in particular was of interest because it was located only 20 miles away. Most of the buses I'd seen previously were hundreds of kilometers out of town, and that would have incurred some pretty huge towing fees. And get this, the owners of this bus? They're TikTokers. Yep, small world. One of them, Kai, runs a TikTok channel called The Ugly Truckling, which is mostly about the tiny home she built on a truck chassis. And she has over 1 million followers there. Kai and her partner Ben bought Big Blue from a landowner way up north. It had been parked up by a lake for decades and had a bathhouse attached to one side. It had been neglected for a while though, and the new landowner just wanted it out of there. Kai and Ben bought the bus with the intention of fixing it up and selling it as a mobile tiny home. Unfortunately, as often happens with vintage vehicles and plans, they ended up having to sell it. Now, even with towing at a few grand, the cost to acquire it was just a fraction of what it would cost to build an equivalent amount of space. I had a laneway beside our house that I could easily fit it in, and I wouldn't have to worry about pouring concrete or filling out permit applications. So that's what I decided to do, folks. Buy Big Blue, clean it up, and then use it as a permanent dedicated space for tech time traveler videos, work on projects, and tinker with a vintage vehicle. That it's a school bus is just a bonus, and I've enjoyed having my childhood fascination with school buses rekindled. Now, I'm going to show off Big Blue in a couple of minutes here, but this wouldn't be a proper tech time traveler video if I didn't give it some historical context. We all know school buses, right? We see them every day plying our roads, big yellow and black colored tanks transporting our future back and forth to their education. Almost everybody who was ever a student at one time has probably ridden a school bus at least once, whether it was for daily transportation back and forth from home or just a field trip somewhere. School buses look pretty basic, but they actually represent nearly 100 years of technological innovation. Before school buses, kids who were fortunate enough to obtain an education often had to walk long distance to the nearest schoolhouse. After 1852, American states began to make education compulsory, and that presented a problem: how to get so many kids spread out over a vast area to school efficiently. Schools initially devised horse-drawn wagons, referred to as school wagons or kid hacks, to haul kids around. But by the 1890s, parents and schools alike were looking for better options. Enter Wayne Works of Indiana. If you rode school buses in the 1970s, 80s, or 90s, you might remember that name. Wayne built a lot of them before going out of business in the mid-1990s. Wayne's first creation in the school bus department was a horse-drawn quote-unquote school car, basically a special-purpose wagon with a single entrance at the tail end and long benches on either side. The arrival of the gasoline-powered automobile led to the first vehicles we might consider to be actual school buses, and these were typically built on something like a Model T chassis. During the Great Depression, rural America was devastated and began to hollow out. At their zenith, there were nearly 200,000 single-room schools in operation in 1915, but over time that number would dwindle to a little over 1,200. As schools consolidated, the need to ferry students back and forth grew considerably. In the mid-1920s, Albert Luce Sr., a Ford dealership owner in Georgia, began working on his own version of a passenger bus to assist a customer looking to transport their vehicles back and forth to work. The original wooden bus body Luce devised unfortunately didn't stand up well to rural roads, so he innovated further by adding a steel frame underneath. Luce eventually formed the Bluebird Body Company in 1932, whose iconic logo you've doubtless seen adorning many school buses in your lifetime, and which once adorned my own bus. In fact, Bluebird No. 1, built in 1927, is still preserved at the Henry Ford Museum today. In the 1930s, vehicular safety was still in its infancy, and this was certainly true for school buses. Due to construction methods and the lack of modern safety systems, accidents could involve some pretty horrific injuries. A spate of terrible accidents in 1935 in particular drew national attention to the problem. Bluebird's response to this was to start making all steel bodies, but improvements wouldn't end there. The accidents and accompanying student deaths led to the creation of a conference that would eventually lead to the adoption of national safety standards for buses. Dr. Frank Sear, a teacher and rural education expert, organized a conference at Columbia University attended by transportation officials, manufacturers, and paint companies in 1939 to try and hammer out some standards for school bus design, both to improve safety and consistency in construction. Many of these standards still persist to this day. For example, the famous School Bus Yellow, initially introduced as National School Bus Chrome, but later known as National School Bus Glossy Yellow due to its high visibility in difficult conditions. Interior changes switched from having benches along either side of the bus to front-facing seats. Widths and ceiling heights were also standardized. The mid-1940s saw some key developments, the arrival of the familiar flashing red warning lights, a crude implementation of which is believed to have first appeared in Virginia in 1946. Secondary amber lights to warn of an impending stop were added shortly thereafter for most states. Traffic laws were amended to require drivers to stop when the lights were activated. And a small paddle-operated stop sign also began appearing on many buses. In the 1950s, as the baby boom produced ever larger cohorts of students, school buses became larger and longer, based on a medium-duty truck chassis rather than the light-duty chassis of the past. Diesel power arrived for some buses in 1954, although many remained gas-powered. Wheelchair lifts also began appearing during the 1950s. Also around this time, smaller school buses based on a van chassis were developed to deal with congested urban environments or low-demand areas. In 1967, Ward Body Works of Arkansas conducted roll tests on one of their bus bodies to identify structural weak points. Up to this time, buses had been constructed of multiple steel panels fastened together with rivets or screws or such. Ward's test demonstrated that the joints where these panels met were prone to buckling and failure during crashes. This prompted competitor Wayne Corporation to introduce the famous Lifeguard design for their own bus bodies, which featured single panels that ran the entire length of the bus for interior and exterior roof and sides. Even to this day, school buses continue to be laboratories for safety innovations, with tweaks to windshield and window designs, improvements in aerodynamics, and fuel economy happening all the time. Very recently, school buses began to sport safety belts, something absent for most of the school buses' existence. As of 2024, a number of big names in school bus making have vanished, including companies like Wayne and Superior, but others like Thomas and Bluebird are still very much alive and kicking. And that brings us to where I find myself today in 2024 with Big Blue. The opportunity to own a rather large piece of transportation history parked just a short distance from my house was too good to pass up, along with the ability to create a dedicated space for my YouTube filming and other pursuits. Yeah, I really wish I had some historical photos of Big Blue back in its school bus days, but unfortunately I don't. This black and white photo of a 66 or 67 Dodge-based school bus is pretty much as close as I can get, and I think this is actually a Bluebird. It just has a different configuration above for the warning lights and the signboard. And why a bus? Why not a trailer or RV, since those were designed to feature living quarters? Well, I did consider those, but in my research I learned a lot of unflattering things about the way RVs and trailers are usually constructed. That is to say, they're constructed pretty badly. Trailers and RVs are typically flimsy, wood-framed, metal-clad boxes on wheels which shake and break over use and promptly begin leaking. And leaking is one of the prime reasons why people tend to offload theirs. A school bus, however, was designed to keep scores of young children alive in a crash. Consequently, they're built like tanks. Of course, school buses have their own set of problems. They're not well insulated, for example, because even in winter, most students boarding them are just there for a short time and they're decked out in winter clothes. But structurally, they're a rock, and a rock is a pretty good thing to build your house, or man cave, or YouTube studio on. So I guess I should take you on the 25-cent tour, huh? Where to start? Well, I guess we start on the outside. I gotta say, for a shortish school bus, Big Blue looks absolutely huge in its pen here. My laneway is about 11 feet across and Big Blue is about 8 feet across, and that leaves very little room for the doors to open, a further 12 inches on one side. It's working with the bus kind of parked over to one side, but yeah, getting computers in and out will be a challenge unless I change the hinging on the doors. Yeah, Big Blue is massive. Like, I've never owned a vehicle that I couldn't reach the top of. Speaking of the top, you'll notice Big Blue is currently tarped. On the first day I got it here, I discovered one rainy afternoon that it leaked. My bad. But I think I know why. I put my cell phone camera on a stand and then held that up, and it seems there's a marker light missing on the top, so I think the rain is just running down through there where the wire goes through. Big Blue actually came with a tarp, but yeah, on the drive back it kind of did a bad impression of a parasail and ripped itself in half. It was kind of old anyway. So I bought a new one and discovered firsthand just how hard it is to set up something like this when you're not tall enough to reach over the roof. Like, it literally took me almost an hour. But once covered, all the leaking issues immediately stopped. Now, getting Big Blue here in the first place, that was an adventure. It was at the very back of a farm field about 20 miles from here, and the owner of the field was a friend of Kai and Ben's and really didn't want people messing up his grass. So we had to wait a couple weeks after I bought the bus to move it out of there. Buying a bus that's parked in a field during the fall in British Columbia is probably not a good idea, because that's usually when the rain starts and things start turning into mud really fast. We basically needed a few days of sun in order to let the field dry out enough that a tow truck would be safe going in there. Yeah, that's a piece of advice I'd like to offer here. If you have the opportunity to buy a vintage school bus that doesn't run, don't. Because towing a school bus is not like towing a car. Not every towing company wants to do it, and the ones that want to do it may not want to do it your way. Kai and Ben had Big Blue brought in on a flat deck, as its wheelbase is just short enough for that. But our local towing companies, for some reason, were really skeptical of using a flat deck, and the only one I could find that actually seemed to want to work with me wanted to use a massive tow truck and haul Big Blue out on her wheels, which I'm thinking might be the first time her wheels are actually used for any extended distance in years. Waiting for a couple of days with no rain seemed to be a pretty tall order this fall in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, we had a summer with almost no rain, and now we seem to be making up for every single drop we missed. Anyway, I was panicking that Big Blue's tires, which are ancient and rotting bias ply type tires, would simply fall apart, even though the journey was short, and then we'd really have a problem. Luckily, I was wrong. Mitchell's Towing of Vancouver got the job done. Nice going, guys. They made placing the bus in the laneway beside my house look like absolutely no big deal. I gotta say, it's really weird to go from having nothing beside your house to having over 100 new square feet of interior space overnight. But I like that Big Blue is no longer sinking into a farm field and being attacked by grass. Yeah, anyway, Big Blue is about 22 feet long from nose to tail and is otherwise pretty much the same dimensions as a regular school bus. I feel like 22 feet is probably just long enough. A familiar sight on school buses, the warning flashers are gone. I was a little disappointed about that, but yeah, based on what I can make out of the mounting holes in the front and back, Big Blue had just a single red flasher on each side, front and back. No amber. That was kind of common on a lot of Canadian school buses. We're polite and we don't need additional warning around here to stop. Obviously, Big Blue's original paint color was yellow, and we can see remnants of it here and there, especially under the underside of the hood. I'm almost tempted to try and use paint thinner or something on the blue parts of the paint, just to see if I can gently remove some of it and see if I can see any hint of the school district name or company the bus worked for, if it's still there. Looking closely though, it kind of looks like there's another maroon colored paint under the blue. Anyway, this is going to all have to be repainted soon. Thankfully, the body is made of galvanized steel, which can last a very long time against rust. Unlike most modern school buses, Big Blue doesn't have an emergency door right at the back. I don't think back then there were any hard and fast rules about this. School buses are all kind of one-offs in a way. They're very much customized to the specific needs of each school district that they work in. Some Bluebirds I've seen of the same vintage as mine have an emergency exit at the back, some of it have it at the back on the driver's side, and some actually don't have any at all. Kai and Ben thought Big Blue fell into the latter category, and that the previous owners who turned it into a bed and breakfast just cut a hole in the side of the bus. However, I think that's not correct, and that's probably a good thing since cutting into the side of one of these things could compromise the structure. For one thing, the trapezoidal windows at each end, they're actually different widths. And also we can see that the ribs that run down the side of the bus are clearly factory tapered on the side where the hole is, and around the hole is what looks like factory framing. My guess? There was an emergency door here, which the B&B owners removed, and then I think they cut the roof back a bit to avoid having guests needing to stoop down to go into the bathhouse. In one photo Kai supplied me, you can see part of the roof bent up over the new higher roof that the B&B people built. I think the rest of the metal was used to fill in this window here where the badly faded duck logo is. One area of concern with this bus is the wheels and tires. People who know their vintage truck wheels will know immediately that these wheels are the infamous Firestone RH5 Widowmakers. Yeah, these are a two-piece rim that lock together during inflation. I think they were designed that way in a time when they didn't have those fancy tire mounting machines. It just made it easier to get things together. Unfortunately, they are known as Widowmakers for a reason, and it's because they're very dangerous during the inflation process. Truck tires are usually inflated to north of 50 psi, I think as much as 90 or 100. That's a lot of force that can escape suddenly if the tire slips off the rim. And yeah, on the Widowmaker, if that happens, the wheel becomes a rocket right into your face. Yeah, these rims are kind of hard to replace without replacing the rotors, so I'm not really sure what I'm going to do about these, especially since I don't see Big Blue going for any fancy trips on the highway. Unfortunately, the one tire I can't easily reach due to its closeness to my neighbor's fence gave up the ghost immediately after arriving. Of course it did. I can reach literally every other tire on this bus except that one. Anyway, yeah, at least for now it's not going to roll anywhere. So yeah, I'm going to have to decide pretty quickly what to do about these because, I don't want to take any chances with my life trying to reinflate it. And yeah, replacements are kind of hard to get. The underside of the bus is super clean for a Canadian vehicle, and this was one of the first things that a Canadian collector should always look for. I think this is partly due to the galvanized steel, but also because the floor sits much higher than the floor of a car, so it's not quite getting hit with as much road salt and debris. Everything's here mechanically, except for the muffler. I don't know what the f*** happened to that. I really hope rodents didn't make their way up into the engine this way. I've heard of cherry bomb mufflers, but yeah, this is a little ridiculous. Okay, so here's the engine bay, and yeah, today it looks pretty clean actually, but it did not look like this when I got it. We weren't able to get the hood latch to open when I was considering buying the bus, but Kai assured me there was a sizable beaver nest in there. I thought it was an exaggeration, but turns out it wasn't. Oh, good lord. Oh, wow. Yeah. This thing has not been run for a while. Now, of course, normally when I buy a vehicle, I do check out the engine, but I was expecting this bus to not be running, and its main purpose was to provide space for YouTube, so I wasn't really worried about what condition the engine was in. Maybe I should have been a little more, though. Whatever built a nest in there used sticks that to my eye seem way too big for ordinary Norway rats. I think these must have been placed here by New York sewer rats, or maybe squirrels or pack rats or something. Yeah, it was gross. Piles and piles of rodent poop all over the fenders. You bet I wore a mask to remove it all, although I think viruses like hantavirus generally can't live outside the body for more than several days, and clearly these were old. I followed up with a good power washing with my cheap Home Depot washer with the plastic sprayers that last exactly one season each. Yeah, that looks way better. Yeah, the engine compartment is pretty Spartan. There's no battery here because school buses usually keep those in a compartment underneath the driver. For those keeping track of these things, the engine is a 318 cubic inch Chrysler Poly V8. I think it makes around 150 to 180 horsepower, but don't quote me on that. I can actually turn it over by hand with some effort, so that's probably good. It means it's not seized. Someone left the radiator cap off, sadly, so yeah, it looks like a woodchuck barfed in there. The alternator here isn't a stock Chrysler one. It looks like an aftermarket item from Winnipeg. I actually looked up Wilson Auto Electric. They supplied parts across several provinces, so unfortunately that doesn't help with figuring out where the bus originally worked. I believe this is the original CB antenna, and it's just placed here temporarily under the hood because it was found just on the ground beside the bus in the field when we towed it out. Okay, so let's head inside the bus here, and yeah, the first thing we encounter are the original doors, and I'm really glad to see these because on a lot of skoolie projects, they actually remove the doors and replace them with more functional, actual doors like you'd have on a house. These currently open outwards, but I think they can be configured to swing inwards as well. In fact, a lot of school bus manufacturers offered a whole variety of different ways the doors could open, outwards, inwards, or jackknife, slide, whatever. Not sure what the relative advantages were, but if you wanted it, they could do it. Ah, the stairs. I have so many memories climbing these as a 10-year-old, the pleasing clunk as you step up with your boots. Sadly, the original door opening handle and mechanism are long gone. For the last 30 years until the bus was moved from up north, the door handle was basically just a turning block of wood. I'm not sure I'd want to be in bear country protected by a 2x2, but I don't see any traces of blood in here, so I guess there were no problems. Maybe I'll check again with a black light. The dash on this bus, like most medium-duty trucks of this era, defines the term basic. Just a smattering of gauges for speed, gas, battery, and oil pressure. The odometer sits at 8,999 miles, and it is miles. Canada didn't switch over to metric until much later. It's a 5-digit odometer though, so pretty much impossible to be sure what the true mileage is. Based on the original condition of the bus and knowing that people back then tended to drive things for far fewer miles overall than today, I'm going to guess that it's probably not really much more than 100,000. There's all kinds of little pull-out levers around here. I'm not sure what T and L do. I think one of them actually opens up a scoop on the cowl that brings fresh air into the cabin. When I got Big Blue, the previous owner had built this fancy cupboard into the footwell area. I think this was partly about storage space, but also to provide insulation from the engine bay. And here's the gearbox. Yeah, Big Blue is a 1-speed manual. You can't see the gas pedal here because of the box the previous owner built, but the clutch and brake were left exposed. There's no driver's seat, unfortunately. Whoever turned Big Blue into a B&B officially decommissioned her as a driving vehicle by removing that. I guess to save space or stop people from sitting there and playing around with the pedals or whatnot. Thankfully, they left the steering wheel in place. My childhood bus driving fantasies can still be fantasized. Enforcing the basicness theme of this bus, there's only one control on the column for turn signal. To the left of the driver's station is this intimidating looking panel, but this is not quite as fearsome as it appears. The bus is a combination of two different manufacturers' efforts. Dodge supplied the front clip and gauges of the bus, but they couldn't anticipate what Bluebird would need in the way of heat controls and lights and so on. So basically Bluebird moved most of the controls you'd typically have on your dash over here. The bus does have a few extras that relate to bus duty, like heavy-duty heaters, pilot lights, and so on. I'm not sure if the switch for the warning lights was on this panel in one of the open holes here or on the door opening mechanism. If I think back, I feel like there might have been a button on the housing for the mechanism that the driver hit before stopping and opening the door. On the top of the control stand we have this cheapo replica radio. The cable runs to a shelf up above here, and I'm not sure what the deal is with that. I have no idea if it works, and it's literally screwed into the wood paneling that the previous owner put here. The shelf over the driver's head I think may have had some speakers or something else going on that the radio was connected to. Originally there would have been just a flat metal panel here holding the bus's builder's plate as well as a first aid kit like this one. And of course there would have been a pretty wide rear view mirror here that the driver would have used. I think that's probably long gone as well, unless they somehow buried it underneath all this paneling. Behind the driver is an old airtight stove. These were sometimes known as bush stoves or hippie killers. The stoves aren't really airtight, of course, but they were known to be a bit dangerous if not actively monitored. They could get extremely hot, gases could build up and cause the stove to burst open, sending sparks and smoke into cramped hippie vans. Yeah, I don't feel inclined to really use this for anything other than decoration. The chimney for it doesn't even have a vent to outside, and from feeling the inside, I don't think it was much if ever used. I'm feeling like it was definitely here for decoration. There is some wood inside, unburned, along with some paperwork from the nearby fridge, and this country music CD cover, and someone's used Kleenex. Ugh. When I was watching Kai's footage, I noticed this little shelf over here used to have a whole stack of wood. The bus itself definitely has a log cabin feel to it, and that's what made me jump on it. It seems to be mostly red cedar, and the builder went to some effort to make it look really nice, including button head screws as well as wood caps where countersunk screws are. The kitchenette is pretty basic. It's a 2-burner propane stove, sink, and what I think is referred to as a 3-way fridge, meaning it can use 12-volt DC power, 115-volt AC power, or propane. Supposedly it doesn't work. I might test it one day. Or not. It's surprisingly clean inside. Yeah, I can just imagine waking up in Big Blue at the crack of dawn to go fishing. Maybe making some eggs or something on the cooktop, drinking some freshly brewed coffee in mugs supplied by the host that were hung in front of this little mini cupboard. I don't really have much actual use for this. The bus never had propane or water tanks installed. Everything, including the electrical, is tied to the bathhouse it was formerly attached to. All of the connections for these things exit above one of the rear wheels. On the other side of the dinette is this little closet space. I was thinking about filling this with soundproofing foam and using it as a little recording space for narration. Thoughts? Yeah, let me know in the comments. It is a little bit awkward being so snug against the wall though, so I don't know, maybe I'll just use it as a closet. And here we have the doorway that used to lead to the bathhouse. When Kai and Ben bought the bus, they agreed to dismantle the bathhouse as part of the deal. I'm not really sure why. I've seen what they paid for the bus and I feel like the previous owner should have been paying them money for this. But anyway, to get the bus home quickly, they just boarded up the old exit real hasty-like. It was not sealed off, and unfortunately that means the whole bus was exposed to moisture while it sat in the field Kai and Ben brought it to for 2 years. This caused more damage to the floors, which I think are a 90s laminate of sorts, and it also caused some mold or mildew to form inside. Oh, and some critters found their way in here too. The back of the bus is pretty much empty. There was originally a bed frame here for a single bed, and I'm guessing this light was for a reading light. I imagine it must have been quite peaceful actually to lie down here at night, listening to the sounds of wildlife outside. Over here we have a classic feature of RVs and trailers, a small dinette. I really love this, and actually this was the first thing I noticed in the photos. Yeah, it's got some wooden bench seats with storage underneath, and it has this really cool table with a chessboard. I really wish the chess or checkers pieces that I presume would have been provided with it were still around. As with many RV dinettes, the table is detachable and it basically lowers down to form a second bed between the two benches. Yeah, honestly, I kind of love this thing. This interior is why I went a little bit above the scrap value many skoolies were suggesting I offer for the bus after I made a post about it on a skoolie subreddit. Skoolies are all about being able to move, and an old bus like this that doesn't run and has holes in it, yeah, they pretty much didn't think it was worth anything really. But I reasoned that while it appeared unlikely anyone would show up for it at the price Kai and Ben were asking originally, buses priced at less than a couple thousand would require major interior work to look like this. Most skoolies I've seen, they're generally pretty functional, unless the person building it had a lot of money. Whoever rented Big Blue really wanted to give it a cozy, inviting feeling. Okay, so here's one of the reasons why I haven't been posting a lot of videos lately. Since I got the bus home a month ago, I've spent every evening and weekend cleaning and fixing it up. The first thing I did after installing the tarp was tackle the mold and mildew inside. I chose cleaning vinegar as my primary weapon of choice, backed up by bleach, and you bet I wore a mask. I did not want to breathe any of that in. Where the vinegar failed, I used some bleach as well as antibacterial cleaning wipes. It was a major job and I was reminded quickly of just how big even a small school bus can be. The next thing I needed to do to keep the mold from coming back was start heating the space. Fixing that leaky exit became a must. Since the weather was so bad, I decided to just use gap filler to seal it for now. My plan is to put a door here, and ideally I'd love to find an actual Bluebird emergency door, but that might be impossible. I also plan to fix the roof by riveting on some replacement metal. I also used gap filler at the bottom of the door here. Probably for a gap that large, the proper thing to do would be to put wood there, but yeah, that's not how I roll. I just wanted to get a basic seal in place, leaving some room to thread some extension cords through, since wiring up the bus's questionable power system is not an option right now. That reminds me, in addition to the little reading lights, we have a couple of outlets, but they're not normal. I mean, they're not the usual NEMA standard plugs. I think they're called IEC 15 or 16 or something like that. You often see them on the back of old 8088 or XT class machines for connecting monitors. No idea what the deal is here, but I'm guessing maybe to prevent guests from plugging in stuff willy-nilly to the limited power system of the bus/bathhouse. Maybe it forced guests to ask the owner first? Humidity in the bus was really bad for the first week, and it's just a lot of buildup in there, but over time the heat drove it out and the windows weren't fogging anymore. I even got a little indoor humidity detector. High humidity is bad news for people and computers. And more cleaning. Yeah, the bus was starting to smell a little bit like a fish and chip truck with all the vinegar I was using, but yeah, it's actually quite effective. And that's when I noticed, despite all my cleaning efforts, the bus still had this funk to it. I couldn't quite place it. At first I thought it was just mold or mildew that I hadn't found, but yeah, that's not what it was. It was something much worse. I wanted to find out if Big Blue still had a gas pedal behind the cabinet that was built, so one day I pried off a board and discovered this. Yeah, the rat's nest that had been under the hood, apparently whoever built it managed to break in under the gear shift as well. Manual gear shifts often have a boot at the base, and this can be removed to expose a hole in the floor that gives access to the base of the shifter and the top of the transmission. The owner had been smart and gap-filled it, but the rodents ate through that. Anyway, I spent a really fun-filled afternoon removing the cabinetry and pulling about 10 more pounds of rat poop and nesting material out. And then more cleaning. Definitely the bus started to smell a lot better after that. The only negative was the cabinet was toast, and that meant losing insulation for the cabin, since there was now only thin metal between the outside and the inside under the dash. I've got some floor mat insulation on order to solve that problem, but for now it is what it is, and I'm just not going to look at my electric bill. I also discovered that the cowl scoop thing up top is leaking, which I tried to caulk, but the rain was just relentless and destroyed it. Need at least a week or two of sun to pull that off. At least the shifter shifts now. Man, this is the most satisfying thing in the world to mess around with. There's a satisfying clunk as you go into each gear, and it does seem to go into all gears, which is good. Note, the shift pattern is a little different from what you usually see. First gear is way over and up to the left, without a second gear directly under or above it. This is what's known as a granny gear, and it's designed to let the bus creep along at low speed and low RPM without stalling. This is useful since buses spend a lot of time in low speed areas like the bus loop at a school. Most drivers under normal conditions would have started out in second gear. Now with things starting to stabilize, I started planning on what I was going to do to make this a functional studio space. And I'm kind of torn on that. I can film using the dinette for a lot of things, but a YouTube studio really doesn't need a kitchenette. The counter space is too small to do anything useful, and the sink sadly doesn't work, otherwise I'd be using it for my PCB etching projects. At the same time, I can't quite bring myself to modify or tear it apart. Someone put a lot of effort and pride into this bus, and I'm loath to mess with that. Plus, I'm also a bit of a prepper at heart. We live in an earthquake, wind, forest fire, volcano, and flood zone. Having a bug-out bus doesn't seem unreasonable. See, here we go again with me not being able to give the channel anything that's entirely its own. Yeah, but I think at the back I'm definitely going to create a desk or a workbench of some kind, maybe something that can be turned into an extra bed. I'm thinking I may use the old bathhouse door here for a desktop. It's pretty solid. I was going to use it as an actual door for the old emergency exit, but that would require cutting it down massively, and that just feels wrong to me. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm open to design ideas. And a name. I've been calling this bus Big Blue, which is kind of obvious, although funny enough, it actually relates to something computer related, IBM. And the word bus itself has some computing connotations. Remember the Q bus, PCI bus, Altair bus? I don't know, what do you think? I did throw up some RGB lighting in here. There, that should be good for an extra 10,000 subscribers. I've dragged out a couple of my computers for some camera testing, but this past week or so I found myself just popping out here every evening for a quick Sierra adventure game session. I don't know why. I've got a perfectly good house right next door, but I just really like it in here. It feels homey and peaceful. Classy even. When I sit in here, I think about all the people who interacted with this bus over the years, like the B&B guests. I wonder how many spent time here fishing, swimming, and then bedding down in a cool 1960s bus for the night. It doesn't get more unique than that. But I also think about the bus's more distant past. This bus has been around for almost 60 years. It was here for the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin. It was here for the Summer of Love, for the first airing of It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, for Woodstock, for Apollo 11 and Apollo 13, Led Zeppelin, disco, and a handful of presidents. When I sit at these windows, I'm reminded that children who are now my parents' age once sat looking out through this very glass. How many young hands reached for the window latches to get some wind on their faces? Who were they? How old were they? What school did they go to? Did they go on any field trips, school dances? What became of them? What happened to the drivers who took them safely from place to place? The mechanics who serviced the bus? So many stories I bet this old bluebird could tell if it only had a voice. Well, it kinda does. Every now and again she gives up some clues to her past. Like for example, her original ignition key. Right on the back here we have the number 41 carved into it, which kind of gives us an idea as to the size of the fleet this bus was part of. Yeah, there's definitely some history here, and I'm glad to be part of this unwitting network of people who spent time in this old school bus. That's it for now, folks. Back to our regular programming soon, I hope. I know, I'm useless with schedules, and I've got so much work still to do, like figuring out lighting and all these other things. But this was a worthwhile decision overall, I think. And I think once it's done, it's really going to help me with production for the channel. I'm glad I pulled this old girl out of the muck and have given her yet another lease on life. I'm hoping one day to get Big Blue running again, even if it's just to get it a short distance out of its laneway so that I can do maintenance on the house. Thanks so much for watching this loving and slightly off-topic look at school buses. And now for our goodbye message, brought to you by Crack Squirrel.
Crack Squirrel here. If you like this video, smack that like button. Wait, what? If not, smack the, what's it called? Dislike, yeah. What else? Patreon. Yeah, he has a Patreon or something. Crack Squirrel out.